All right, everybody, it's Talking About Books time, and I am here today to talk about The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafon, translated by Lucia Graves, and I'm sure I butchered both of those names as ever. And this is an interesting one for me because coming off of it from everything that I said about Caratescu and Blinding and postmodernist works, and particularly maximalist works, the reason that I chose this book to read next was I wanted something after these sort of really, really dense paragraphs, lighter, that I really enjoyed and could enjoy, but didn't quite require so much taxing on my reading. And so this book for me has, ever since I found it 5 years ago, been an immense guilty pleasure. I've returned to it multiple times and reread it, and every time really, really enjoyed it to the point where I actually own a few copies. And yet, at the same time, the reason that I call it a guilty pleasure is that it's not as deep as the stuff that I usually read, and we'll get into that in the pros and cons. But particularly, one of the reasons that I have this part of the review is to give context. And context is always important when you go into reviewing things, I think, to talk about where you're coming at it from, and understanding that I came to this from the dense, what I called, I struggled, I didn't want to call it overwritten, but the really, really dense maximalist prose into this really colored this particular reading of the book for me in a sort of almost negative light. And we'll get into that too. But also sprinkled in here, I debated separating this into a different video or not, but it's going to be a little bit of a conversation about the difference between kind of high literature, low literature, and art, and what can make kind of art come alive a little bit. So getting into it, I mentioned the context already. Brief plot overview for those of you who don't know about this book. It follows Daniel Sempre. I don't know how to pronounce the names, as ever. It's set in Barcelona, in Spain, as he finds... It begins when he's 10 years old, I believe. He might be 8. I think he's 8, but I'm not sure. And he wakes up having forgotten the face of his mother and is absolutely petrified. His mother died during the war, and the Spanish Civil War, which, if you don't know much about that, I recommend doing a little bit of history and reading Hemingway. A lot of Hemingway's books covered that. So interesting contrast between those two, especially, Hemingway was an American who was participated or covered the Spanish Civil War. And now you get something from a Spaniard that deals heavily with the shadow of the Spanish Civil War. Anyway, Daniel wakes up having forgotten the face of his mother. His father takes him to a place called the Cemetery of Forgotten Books, which, as dramatic as it sounds, is really just a kind of library where people bring books that are either destroyed or scheduled to be destroyed or otherwise kind of forgotten by the world. And it's custom when you come to the Cemetery of Forgotten Books to take a book with you, and it's kind of implied that whatever book that you take with you is your soulmate and has kind of been waiting there to be sought out. And he takes a book called The Shadow of the Wind, brings it home, reads it, becomes infatuated with it, and this sets off a quest to discover more about the writer of the book and the history behind the book. And it spans up until, I think, Daniel is about 18, so about 8 years. That's a brief plot overview, but it's... my mind is blanking right now. It's very much a book about books, but more so about readers than it is anything else. And a book that very romantically focuses on the attachment that people have to books and the influence that books can have on people. Would I recommend this book or not? This is where it gets interestingly challenging, because the book is pretty popular on its own. If you're listening to this, you may have already heard of it, and a lot of people who read it really, really enjoy it. I really, really enjoy it in some ways, But at the same time, I am not ignorant of the flaws of this book, and I think that if you are a more serious reader, somebody who comes into literature for a more serious angle, and particularly given the other things that I have covered on this channel, then I think that it's not necessarily going to be a book for you. But if you just kind of approach things just looking for a good story and you're not looking for some deep literary insights, then I recommend it. Even though, and okay, I'm forgetting my own format because it's to whom would you recommend it, not would I recommend it. And the thing with the rereading it again and coming back to it off of Caratescu is where I sort of criticize Caratescu for being, and I'm just going to say the word to sort of have a catch-all. It's not, go watch the whole video if you want the nuance. Overwritten in the sense that it's that dense maximalist prose. The Shadow of the Wind is also overwritten to me, which is why I don't like the word overwritten, because it can mean so many different things and has so much connotation associated with it. In the sense that it's so romantic, so flavorful in every single line that in a sense it starts to undercut itself, was my feeling, particularly reading it this time. It reminds me so much of somebody constantly trying to impress you with their witty turns of phrase and their clever statements, where once or twice it's okay and it's endearing and there's a kind of timing to it. But this kind of has, reading it this time, like every other line feels like it's trying to be witty, or it's trying to be clever, or it's trying to make some kind of insight. And it ends up overbearing to me, particularly just in the mindset that I'm in right now. And I can see that being really grating to some people, particularly, maybe the people who would like maybe sort of the more maximalist works, especially since for all of the fanciful dialogue, I really don't think that the book itself is super deep in terms of its themes or what it's trying to say or explore. So in that sense, I don't want to say it's a dumb book masquerading as being smart, because that's exactly the kind of reductionist statement that I want to avoid on this channel. But it's somebody with a very, very clever tongue, with a silver tongue, speaking, but whose statements aren't quite as deep or profound as they might seem, and it might convince a lot of people that it's very deep and profound, but the more you break it down, the more that there are certainly flaws or oversimplifications in the arguments. All of which sounds like I'm saying that I wouldn't recommend it at all, but it's not. It's more, there is a certain magic, a certain charm to it, especially if you're somebody who grew up with books, if you're somebody who grew up finding comfort in books because of having limited social interactions. I think that it's very easy to be charmed by this book and to be taken in by this book, and to enjoy the journey that it's gone through and that it goes through. And one of the other things that I see brought up about the book a lot in criticisms of it is the way that it treats women and the female characters. And while I want to get into that a bit more later, I will say that it's almost classic in the way that it plays out. It's got a lot of the classical noir tropes, the femme fatales and things like that, that it will actually call out as, she reminded me of a femme fatale out of a book. And, in a way, the self-awareness can be endearing. Sometimes it can be overbearing. And I guess that's ultimately what it comes down to. Sometimes I read this book and I really enjoy it and I really get into it. And sometimes, like this last time, there are moments where I just find myself like, oh God, please just tone it down a little bit. But I even when I'm struggling to engage with it, I think that there's a certain earnestness in the writing which comes through and really saves the book not saves, but really keeps it from getting quite so far down the rabbit hole that I would still recommend it. Like I said, guilty pleasure. Absolutely a guilty pleasure. So getting into the sort of pros and cons. And this is where I can be a bit more nuanced with my discussion. And this is where I kind of want to bring in this broader conversation about art and the way we talk about art. So the first thing that I want to bring up as both a pro and a con, because I've already talked about it a bit, is the writing. Because the writing has a style and a voice. And that unto itself is a pro. And it's a voice and a style that can be grating to me at times, but it's also very distinct. And this is where, coming from like Caratescu, where, don't get me wrong, he had a voice. I find that this book is so easy to read. The sentences just flow. It's polished to a fucking, like, okay, where Caratescu writes his works and doesn't go back and edit them, this feels almost like the opposite extreme, where every single sentence has been polished and shaved off to a mirror sheen. And this could always be a translation thing. Put a pin in that curious anecdote that I'll come back to. But the fact of the matter is, it goes almost so far to the point where I feel like it starts to become almost unrealistic, disingenuous in a way. Like the kind of person who's always happy, always clever, always witty, to the point where their flaws, and the flaws are, to me, things that kind of make people human. And if something is trying to be so perfect, or I guess another way to put it is like TV shows that are always trying to get your attention, always trying to hold your attention, always trying to be funny, always trying to be witty. You could call it like the Marvel effect, I guess, with the banter and whatnot. But, never letting your attention drift for a second, it starts to get exhausting, and it starts to feel disingenuous, and it starts to feel artificial. Artificial, that's the word that I really want to get, because I think it kind of is what is at the heart of why I'm struggling to connect with this book to the same degree that I used to this time around. Because, again, when you clean it, when you polish it so much, it does start to resemble an ideal more so than it does reality. And that's where, don't get me wrong, the prose is extremely pleasant to read, and your eyes will just glide through the pages, unless, like me, they're constantly stopping to be rolled every once in a while. And it's this sort of over-exaggeration, romanticization? Is that even a word? This overly romantic approach where there's just these constant pauses for what we for little pieces of observations or whatnot, where it sounds nice, it sounds pleasant, it sounds deep, but is it really? And I will get an example here for a second, so I'll be right back. Okay, so for context, this is after the main character has returned to the cemetery of books, and for reasons he is attempting to hide the book that he took. This is page 76, so not a spoiler, doesn't contain any spoilers, don't worry about it. Without further ado, I left the place, finding my route by the marks I had made on the way in. As I walked in the dark through the tunnels and tunnels of books, I could not help being overcome by a sense of sadness. I couldn't help thinking that if I, by pure chance, had found a whole universe in a single unknown book, buried in that endless necropolis, tens of thousands more would remain unexplored, forgotten forever. I felt myself surrounded by millions of abandoned pages, by worlds and souls without an owner, sinking into an ocean of darkness, while the world that throbbed outside the library seemed to be losing its memory, day after day, unknowingly, feeling all the wiser the more it forgot. And this is exactly what I mean, where it's the kind of passage that some people are going to be really attached to. They're going to particularly I think people who are sympathetic to books and to the power of books. And I certainly sympathize with this idea that there are books that are so impactful to us, but the way in which it's written is so extremely flowery that I think for some people it's going to be an immediate turnoff. And where you fall on that, I think, is really going to define your enjoyment of this book, because in much the same way that I was talking about Caratescu and how the maximalist style made it impossible for me to get into it, this particular way, this romantic, flowery language is going to, it permeates the whole book. There's no getting away from it. And if that bothers you, if you don't gel with it, then there's no getting past that. Or, like for me, it kind of chafes me because it's so omnipresent in everything it does. There's a chapter, like chapters ending on zingers. There's one that ends with, in a week's time, I would be dead. And it's like, I don't like those kinds of zingers. I would rather you just leave me alone, let me experience the story. Again, like I said, it reminds me of sort of a lot of modern art where it's not going to just let you get bored. It's so afraid that you might get bored that it's constantly trying to entertain you and divert your attention away. Curiously, going back to the anecdote that I mentioned earlier, I had recommended this book to somebody in Japan, in Japanese, and they read it in Japanese, and they mentioned that while they enjoyed the story, in Japan it's split into two books. They only read the first book because the translator had opted to translate it into a very archaic form of Japanese that they did not enjoy reading. So while it was an enjoyable, while they were interested in the story and the characters, the older Japanese was very difficult for them to follow. And when I told them, I was surprised by that because the book had released in like the year 2000, I think it's like 2001 or something. They were outright shocked. So to that end, translation really makes a difference. And I'm really left wondering, if the Japanese version could have been translated in that style, how much of what I'm talking about with the language is in the translation versus the original. Especially considering every single discussion I see obviously is in English, and therefore I assume by default that these people, unless they explicitly state otherwise that they've read it in the original Spanish, have read the translation. So I think for a large part of the world, this is, regardless of what the original was, their only vision of the book. And this is why I think having multiple translations can be so important and beneficial to works. So anyway, moving on from the writing, because I've already harped on that for so fucking long. Another pro-con is the way that the book treats women. And this, I'm going to tie this in with the pro-con of, I already kind of mentioned it. The book has a lot to say, but a lot of its themes aren't explored very deeply. And this will tie into what I'm going to talk about in ARC. So one of the biggest things that I see people complain about, and it hasn't escaped my attention that I also really, really love Murakami, and a lot of Murakami's books are criticized for his portrayal of women. And however I feel about that, really, really recommend you read the Murakami short story Sleep. Absolutely fantastic, and a female protagonist. I like to think that all of his female protagonists have this kind of life going on inside of them, and he just doesn't portray it. Anyway, it has not escaped my attention that this is another book that I really, really enjoy, that one of the biggest problems most people have with it is its portrayal of women. But moving on, broadly speaking, it is true that most of the women in the book do end up playing the role of not sort of damsels almost. That while there are some women who take charge on their own, they're very minor characters, or they tend to be in the background, or when they do have more pluck or individuality, they tend to play a minor part in the overall plot. Like Bay, I think, Beatriz, I'm not sure how they pronounce it in Spain, Daniel's love interest in the book, is described multiple times as being very plucky, but at the same time is, by the end of the book, she really only has one rebellious moment, and otherwise, another character, Nuria Manfert, ends up being way more of an active player in the ultimate plot of the story than Beatrice, despite her being such an important character, and a character described as being very independent, very strong-willed. Like I said, she only does one really super independent thing, and outside of that, she's mostly just kind of following along to people's whims. And maybe this has to do with the role of women in Spain in the 1940s and 1950s. And I do think that there are some strong female characters, but if you're going to come into this book looking for strong, independent female characters, you're probably not going to find it. But, and this is where I get into the conversation about art things. With this in mind, and reading the book again this time, one of the things that really stood out to me, and Julian, one of the characters in the book, the way that the book describes Julian, it portrays him very sympathetically. He is very, very clearly meant to be a character that you sympathize with. And yet, one of the exercises that I like to do when it comes to thinking about characters, thinking about these sort of conversations about what makes a well-written female character, what makes a well-written male character, is flip their genders and ask yourself, how does this change how you feel about the character? Because I'm not gonna lie, I think everybody has their own sort of internal biases one way or another about men and women, and thinking about the type of character Julian is, how I would feel to him and about how the world would react to him were he a woman, I kind of made me appreciate how much, even though the book is sympathetic towards him, he really is a very, very selfish individual. And the way that he treats other people around him, he uses everybody, women who fall in love with him, he will use them, will not use them maliciously, but he will nonetheless take advantage of the fact that they love him. He will sleep with them. He will take advantage of, what am I trying to think here? Not take advantage, not use, but accept sort of their love, their affection. Take this, sleep with them, take the gifts and stuff that they give him. But his whole life is so focused on this one thing, and I won't say what for spoilers, that everything else is secondary, and everybody else just kind of ends up agreeing to this. And again, when you read the book, it's obvious that this selfish behavior, even though it is called out by characters, including many of the women that he does... he doesn't seduce them, but who are seduced sort of by his allure. Though the book calls it out, it's obvious that the book still wants you to sympathize with Julian. And this is where these sort of thought about high art versus low art comes in to me, because it was an interesting thought, an interesting way of approaching the book, because I don't necessarily, I obviously like to look at things analytically, but I also don't want to approach, things that were never meant to be taken super seriously and apply a super serious analytical lens to them, because I think sometimes you end up missing the forest for the trees. If you want to apply, let's say, a Jungian or Freudian analysis to Harry Potter, go ahead. I'm obviously not going to stop you, but I think you're going to be very limited in what you dig up. And at the same time, with The Shadow of the Wind, what I found with Julian and what I think it says about the way in which the sort of implicit subtext of it is this kind of boys will be boys and we should sympathize with him because he is what he is. It's more, to me, a statement, not even a statement, it's more a indicative, let's use the word indicative, of the older type of writing, the older type of story that The Shadow of Wind is very much trying to be, then it is likely a deliberate choice on the part of Carlos Ruiz Zafon to be making any kind of grand statement about roles or whatnot, or even this sort of subtextual statement about everyone kowtowing to Julian and whatnot. Like it's, if you take this story and you read it with that level of depth and analysis, I think you will come away with something probably that the author didn't intend. And while that is worth bringing up to me, I think that there's also this other side of things where if you do go into the book, again, expecting that level of depth, when this really is more of a lighthearted romantic adventure, a kind of throwback to the past, then, I don't want to say you're reading it wrong, but you're definitely not. Some of the responsibility still falls on you for choosing to approach a work in that style that is very clearly not meant to be taken that way. As with everything, there are these gradients. But at the same time, I also don't want to necessarily write things off as just entertainment. And this is where, because even entertaining things that aren't themselves inherently deep or leading to deeper discussion can lead to surprisingly interesting conversations. And this is where I'm going to step outside of The Shadow of the Wind for a second and talk about a conversation that I had with a friend, in which we were talking about, I've been replaying a video game, Dragon Age Origins, and one of the common occurrences, well, rather, to paint the scenario first of all, there's a point in the game in which you are ambushed by a group of assassins, and once you best the assassins, their leader begs for mercy, and you can ask him, who sent you? And he says, I don't know, I just accepted the money. And then you have the option to either let this assassin go or kill them. And in role-playing games, oftentimes, almost universally, sparing this assassin is considered the merciful option, the good option, and would give you good karma or whatever. In this case, it doesn't, but it's clear that that's kind of what the game is edging towards in the good option. But to me, the you're sparing somebody who ultimately is the type of person who will end another person's life without asking any questions about who that person is. They'll just accept the money and go and end their life. And to then let that person live is to take upon every single death that they go on to cause onto yourself, because you had the chance to prevent it and you deliberately did not. Knowing the type of person that they are, you chose to show them, maybe one person would say show them mercy, but you chose to let them go. And when I brought this up to a friend, my friend mentioned his own experiences playing tabletop games where they're like, well, we don't want to strike down an unarmed person, but what else are we going to do? It's not like there's a law enforcement that you can turn them over to. And he wanted more options to turn over somebody to law enforcement in games. And from this extremely binary, fuck awful moral choice came an interesting discussion with somebody about when is it morally okay to take somebody's life, because it kind of went on from there into questions, because for me, in my head, if somebody comes at me with lethal intent, then I am absolutely justified in retaliating with lethal intent, even if the person is otherwise incapacitated. I feel justified in that behavior, or at least I do in a theoretical, abstract situation. I also understand that when you're talking about these extreme situations, how people act in the situation itself is utterly different. So I'm not saying this in any kind of absolute terms. I just feel that way about myself and think that this is how I would act. Whereas for him, he has a very different moral compass based on, some of the things that we've talked about in the past. And, like he said, to him, the fact that the person is unarmed, the fact that the person is no longer a threat means that your responsibilities and moral obligations are different. And this is where I think when it comes to conversations about high art and low art and, everything in between, because it's a gradient, remember, it's not A or B, there's also this conversation to be had about what makes good art isn't just what the art makes you think about, but it's about the conversations that I think it can bring up. And I think that conversations around art is really I think, least brought up and considered aspect of art and artistic interpretation and artistic value. Because if all you do is read a book and you think about it and it makes you think, and then you change your lifestyle or you change your way of thinking because of it, that's good. That's excellent. I'm not saying, that's perfect in a way. That's almost ideal. But I think that there's something then to be said for taking that interpretation and talking about it with other people. And that's where I think when it comes to the difference between, let's say, again, high art and low art, the question, what really separates the two, tends to be the depth. And by depth, what I really mean is how much does it challenge your convictions, your understandings? How deep does it dive into these things? What is it really saying? And, it's not that low art can't lead to interesting thoughts if you choose to approach it that way. It's just that oftentimes it doesn't really reward approaching it that way, like with The Shadow of the Wind. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't still find something interesting from it. And it especially doesn't mean that when you go to discuss that art in the broader context or with other people, that you can't still get some really interesting conversations out of it. The difference between the two is really more it's the way that the words and the interpretations and the themes and the way they're explored speaks to people and encourages those thoughts and those types of conversations than it is necessarily implicitly, bad art is always going to be bad for you and good art is always going to be good for you or whatever. It's more the likelihood and the depth, by which I mean, again, how does it encourage you to engage with it? And bringing this back to The Shadow of the Wind and the sort of pros and cons, this is where I would say it's a book where a lot of what it talks about is pretty surface level. And it's not a deep book. Much as I, find what I said about Julian, much as you could probably look at it and its treatment of women, and much as it does sort of talk about war and the shadow of war, and, talks about how books can go on and change people and impact people, the fact of the matter is, from my perspective, it is not it brings up a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily dive into those things as deeply as I would prefer it to. But at the same time, is that a con? Is that something that should be held against the book? I think that just depends on what you're coming into it and what you're expecting out of it. It definitely has more going on, I think, than your typical genre fiction novel. Your typical, okay, let's say that you would classify this as a mystery. Where would you put this in the bookstore? To my knowledge, this is stacked in the literature section of the bookstore. And, compared to a lot of the other stuff you would find in the literature section of the bookstore, I don't think you're going to get quite the amount of depth that you would get out of it. But if you put this in the mystery section of the bookstore, I think it's going to be quite a bit deeper than a lot of the other mysteries in the bookstore. And this is where, genre is debatable, malleable. It's not a conversation that I particularly like getting into, because I think that while it has its place, you end up getting into more semantics arguments, and again, you very much end up missing the forest for the trees. But again, the question is, how are you approaching The Shadow of the Wind? Are you approaching it as a mystery that might have a little bit more going on to it than you expect? Or are you approaching it as literature where you're definitely going to be aware of like the fact that all the female characters pretty much bend over backwards to the whims of the male characters, and a lot of the male characters tend to be very selfish individuals whose actions are justified because the rest of the world is bending over backwards to accommodate them. That is going to vary widely depending on the reader, and it's difficult to talk about this book as I've done. I mean, I've been talking for 35 minutes, kind of oscillating back and forth between saying I like it and then proceeding to completely dump on it, because I like more literary things, and I would be happier with this book if it had more of those literary elements. But to say I would be happier with this book is not the same as saying this is a bad book for not having those elements, or that I want it to have those elements. So that kind of really concludes all the pros. This feels weird tacking this on right at the end, but there is one other con that I have to tack it in here right at the end, even though it doesn't fit into the argument at all. I'm so sorry. But there's just this one other con that I have to like poke in right at the end here, and that's that the book, I don't know if this is the translation, I don't know if this is the editing, but for a book that is so polished, there are a few times, 3 off the top of my head, that the book will say something and then seem to contradict itself. So, for instance, Beatrice, his, like I said, romantic interest in the book, is introduced in one chapter, and then in a flashback where he's describing how he became friends with Thomas, his best friend. Beatrice is Thomas's sister, and he says, "I've always been scared of Beatrice." This is like 2 pages where he recounts this flashback where he insults Beatrice, Tomas beats the shit out of him, and then Tomas makes up with him later, and they become friends. And it's almost the sort of implied subtext is that the whole time that he's been hanging out with Tomas, he's been afraid of Beatrice. He ignores her. They never exchange a word with each other, or they just kind of walk past each other. But then, even though they've known each other for 8 years, that same chapter proceeds to go on to detail him encountering Beatrice and suggesting, not very subtly, that they've both kind of had a thing for each other this whole time. And it's just so not set up that I have to wonder if in the original draft there were more scenes between Daniel and Beatrice as they're growing up that just got cut in the final in order to just polish things down and keep the pace moving. I don't know, but their transition from 2 absolute strangers to people who have always sort of secretly liked each other is so abrupt that it's absolutely insane to me. You have one character who's described as never having been able to read, and then later on in the same recounting is described as regularly reading bedtime stories to someone else. You have a character who's described as never being able to speak again, later on hiring somebody and being extremely talkative. These little slip-ups that it almost feels like in the editing process that so much was changed and tweaked that remnants don't quite line up as much as they should, which is bizarre for something as polished as it is. And it might be the fact that it's so polished that more people don't notice or bring it up. God, I'm at 40 minutes and I haven't brought up themes. And at the same time, throughout this whole review, I've kind of already brought up several of the themes. So I guess I'll blow through the themes section, which is usually the longest part of the video, but this time it'll be the shortest, so go figure. Themes of the book. The reflection between fiction and reality, in which you kind of see yourself in fiction and the way that that can then help shape and influence your life, in the sense that Daniel's life is very defined by his experiences reading Shadow of the Wind. Shadow of the Wind is like all of Caroc's novels. Is it Caroc's? Carot? I don't know. It's French. Like all of Julian's novels, is very self-referential, based on his own life. So in this way, Daniel's life ends up becoming a bit of a mirror of Julian's life. And this is where it's a bit on the nose, because it is fictional, and these kinds of one-to-one mirrors don't really happen in real life. But it does still happen on a smaller scale. It's fine, whatever. The importance of books, the way that books can change people, the shadow of war, and the way that war allows terrible people to get into positions of power. You have some themes of redemption in there, of familial love. I think the tale of the Hatter, Julian's father, who transitions from a mad person, bitter and angry, who beats his wife and his son, to somebody who is repentant for his actions, is handled pretty well, although I think Nuria's forgiveness towards him is a little bit questionable. But as the characters do say, a lot of what they hear about other characters is heard second and third hand. So, our only real understanding of this character is through these stories. But it is interesting to see somebody who had such a demonic relationship with his family feel repentance towards the end. The sort of deep state and the problem with the rule of I can't remember exactly what his name was. It General Franco, during his rule at the end of the Spanish Civil War, which was a bit of a dictatorship, and the sort of fear and terror and police brutality and corruption that came out of that. The importance of family and a community between Daniel and his father, Daniel and the local people at the bookstore, or not the bookstore, but that street, the watchmaker, and how everyone kind of comes together. Second chances with Fumero, and or not Fumero. He's like one of the most important characters in the book, and I'm totally blanking on his name. Fermin. There we go. I cannot believe I forgot his name. Fermin, this sort of stranger on the street, this beggar who does a kindness to Daniel, and in return, Daniel does a kindness to him, and they sort of become fast friends. So, just a lot of these sort of surface level themes, but also, I say surface level, but it's interesting in the way that, like I said, it has a lot of these sort of surface level themes, but then does throw in things in there like the government corruption, and the way that life doesn't treat people well, and the sort of rise and fall of rich empires that do give it that more literary flair and that extra bit of depth and insight that I think elevate it from just being strictly a for fun book to something that is kind of in between. And that's what makes it so complicated to talk about. That's what makes it so complicated to recommend, because it inhabits that strange space where for a lot of people, they have come to it and they have really enjoyed it. And I hope that it has prompted them towards more complicated things. But at the same time, people who do expect more from books approach it, and I read their disappointments with it, and I find myself agreeing. I obviously, throughout the course of this review, have had my own bugbears with it, but at the end of the day, even coming away from it, like I said, complaining about some of the ways, the passages, and feeling like it's a bit overeager to please and whatnot, I still enjoyed this book. I still enjoy this book. And even though I call it a guilty pleasure, in order to recognize, in order to mark it out as separate from the things that I would put in my top list, like, let's just be plain here. For the top of my top three novelists, who I would list as absolute favorites, it's Haruki Murakami, Karl Ove Knausgaard. I'm trying to learn how to pronounce his name correctly. I don't know if I'm doing any better. And The Shadow of the Wind, because I also really enjoyed the follow-up, The Angels Game. Those are my top 3. And then if I go on to the ones that are really, 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 really close, Dostoevsky, Fitzgerald, and Orhan Pamuk. And to say that The Shadow of the Wind is an exception among all those books would be the understatement of the century, in my opinion. But I still fucking enjoy it, and that's cool. But I enjoy it in such a way that I still think that writing it off as pure entertainment is still doing it a bit of a disservice too. It really does inhabit that weird middle space that opens it up to so much different interpretations and whatnot. So see you next time. I'm going to do a quick video that explains my current reading situation and why my reviews from here on out might get a bit weird. So see you then.